All right, well, welcome everyone to the best panel discussion at ETS. This is designing for unanticipated and unintended consequences, so it's all of the fun things that can happen after you've done the exciting work of design. My name's Boyce. I am the Senior Product Director at Market Strategies International, and I'm responsible for our utility trusted brand and customer engagement syndicated study, and I'll drop some data in as appropriate throughout the panel. But let me introduce the panel today. To my immediate left is Bill Meehan, who is Director of Utility Solutions at ESRI. Next to him is Brent Hodges, who does Internet of Things planning and product strategy for Dell. And last but certainly not least is Charles King, who is VP and CIO at KCP&L. I'm going to hand things over to the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and I've also asked them to share with you a fun fact about themselves, just so that it's not all dry utility speak for the entirety of the panel. So, Bill?
Okay, Bill Meehan, as we said, Director of Utility Solution at ESRI. I've been with ESRI for 15 years, but before that, I was head of operations for a power company, and I'm a power systems engineer, so I really come from the power industry and know it and love it very well.
What's your fun fact, Bill?
Oh, the fun fact. I don't want to even say the year, I was playing in a rock band, yeah, and I wasn't in the band, but I opened for a band named the Strawberry Alarm Clock. Has anybody ever heard of that? And what's their hit song? Incense and Peppermints. That's right. There you go.
Wow, that's amazing. I don't know how to follow that.
Yeah, how do you follow that, Brent?
The fact that you were in a rock band, or the fact that there are people in the audience who are actually singing the song.
That's right. Incense and Peppermints.
I don't know.
Right.
So I'm Brent Hodges with Dell. My background, I've been with Dell for about 18 months in the Internet of Things product group. So it's a new line of business that we've launched at Dell. Prior to joining Dell, I used to run manufacturing plants for a while. Then I got into embedded wireless and wireless standards, which eventually led into smart energy and utilities, and worked on smart grid strategy at a couple of utilities, and then worked for a couple of startups in the space as well. So very excited to be part of the panel, talk about the intersection of energy, technology, IoT, etc. And I guess the fun fact about me, I'll pick on my son since he's not here. I have a 9-year-old son. His baseball team is ranked in the top 20 in the country as a 9U team. So, fun fact.
Very cool. Charles.
All right. Good afternoon. Charles King, KCP&L, as Casey said. Been with KCP&L for about 6 years, a little over 3 years, I guess it is now, in the CIO role. In terms of fun fact, I'm going to change it to say interesting fact, because I'm not sure how fun it is when I stop and think about it. But have 5 kids, and that's why I shifted the words from fun to interesting. It's interesting from at least from a financial perspective, because that includes triplets, and so back in those days, which I often say rolls the odometer faster than the age meter. Because you go through a lot of things where you're outnumbered. There's 2 of you, there's 3 of them. You have 2 hands or 2 arms, there's 3 of them. No matter how you look at it, you're outnumbered. And so it also hits you in concurrency when you get to things that cost money, because it comes in threes. Whether that's college, which they all just graduated last year, which that's wonderful. However, the first one's getting married this coming weekend. So. And it's 2 daughters and 1 son, so here we go again. It's going to come in threes. It's just a matter of what the spacing will be. So it's definitely interesting. I also have a 10 and 12-year-old, so that's a desire to stay young at the same time. And you got to relate across generations, right, and try to bridge that gap when you yourself don't belong to any of the generations. But it's definitely interesting, and I guess overall it's fun.
So I think during this panel we're going to pass the hat around for Charles here. I don't know where it is right now, but
Paying off debt is fun. How's that?
All right. Well, so let's start with the big picture. And a lot of the conversation that we had kind of in the prep for this panel was around technology, and certainly that's a lot of what we're dealing with in terms of trends. What are your high-level takes on how technology is impacting utilities? And Charles, let's start with you.
Well, I said this in the prep call. I think I could talk about this topic for the rest of this time and a long time after. From a technology perspective, my view, and by the way, I could have said this came from a competitive industry, telecom, before coming into utilities, and so I think there's a lot of parallels there. In a lot of ways, things are happening in utilities that happened in other industries beforehand. And I think it's just the nature of the beast, because in utilities, in a lot of cases, we have a captive audience or a captive customer, right? In a competitive industry model, it's about survival. It's customer acquisition or retention every day. We're starting to go through some of those types of things in utilities, but a lot of the change I think we're facing is technology-driven or technology-influenced. It's becoming much more rapid in terms of the pace in the past few years from an industry perspective. Whether you call that digital transformation, right, which is out there and used at this conference, whether you call it modernization, whether you call it analog to digital conversion, you can put a lot of different labels on it. What really resonates, I think, is when you start giving examples of how we're experiencing those changes in the industry, whether it's AMI, right, whether it's meter data management, whether it's big data, whether it's IT-OT convergence. A lot of those represent that change that's being driven by or influenced by technology. The other direction we're getting it from is our actual customers, right? Because we're facing an increasing level of customer expectation driven by technology, not necessarily within our industry, but their interactions with other industries that then get levied on us as an industry. And so we're facing it from that perspective as well. And some of that becomes IT-centric, some of it does not. Automation of energy trading markets. You know, the list goes on. And then you've got some technology-specific or IT-specific things like migration to the cloud, software as a service, models, and so forth, which are their own form. But I think in total, tremendous amount of change in this industry recently compared with historical norms.
So it sounds like you're being buffeted by a lot of technological changes, and I do want to come back to some specific examples in a minute. But before we do, Brent, what's your take? What kind of big, high level? What's the impact of technology on the sector?
Yeah, just to build on Charles's comments, I would say that state it as, if you think of a race, we've kind of been in a race to the starting line. I really think we're just at the beginning of seeing what, if you want to call it, digital transformation. If you want to use Internet of Things, if whatever buzzwords you like to put on it. But I think there's been some period of time where a lot of technology has been being developed, both in the industry as well as outside the industry. And it's now starting to come together, and I think most people would agree, listening at this conference, that the energy grid we have today is clearly not the energy grid we will have tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the paradigm that everyone's familiar with, in this audience is certainly, the one-way flow of energy as it's generated centrally. It's worked wonderfully. What we're seeing now, of course, is more two-way flows of not just energy, but now the information that's kind of influencing and impacting energy. And so I think from a utility perspective, it's an interesting time, a fun time to build on Charles, to be involved, because it's I think if you like change, that is. If not, it may not be a great industry to be in.
And
the next
who in
10
the
years.
utility sector doesn't like change?
We all do.
Bill, anything you'd add to that?
Well, since those of you in the audience that remembered the strawberry alarm clock, I've got a little prop that I want to illustrate.
Are you going to sing?
No, I'm not going to sing. Does anybody know what this thing is?
8-track.
An 8-track, right? So we talk about digital transformation, right? So this was analog, right? And this is digital, right? But was that really digital transformation? Really? I can tell you what digital transformation is, if I can find it. Digital transformation in the music industry was this little thing, right? The iPod. It basically took this and everything about the music industry and threw it out the window, right? Because it wasn't about this little iPod, it was about the iTunes platform. And I believe that the utility industry, from a technology perspective, with people like Musk, it's going to be challenged so dramatically that who knows that we can end up with something like this in the future of the industry. So I think it could very well be, we'd be in for a real transformation of the industry. So if we got to, and I think you had said it too, if we want to just continue our merry way, we'll end up selling these things when nobody cares. And so we got to be very careful. But I think as well, I'm also very positive that the technology of a platform, and you heard it here for the second time, I've said this before, that I believe the distribution system, it'll be the distribution system as a platform, not just for selling electricity like we have in the past, but as connectivity, connecting people together in markets that we haven't even invented yet.
So I think this really sets the table very nicely to say that there's a lot of, as a number of you guys have said, transformational things that are happening. Didn't realize you were bringing props. That's
well,
great.
I carry them with me all the time.
And I think it's a good jumping off point for, okay, what are the unanticipated consequences of all of these different technological trends, whether they're things that the utility adopts or whether they're things that are sort of foisted upon us. And I know in the planning call, Charles, you were talking about how KCP&L's AMI implementation was one of the most significant technology implementations that you've been involved in your career. Could you share with us a little bit about just kind of very briefly that program, but more to the point, what were the unanticipated consequences of that AMI implementation, both good and bad?
Okay, sure. Yeah, probably in total context, it is one of the most interesting, in some ways most satisfying experiences from a technology perspective. I mentioned IT-OT convergence earlier. This is an example where it really brought, in our company, operations and IT together in a big way in a combined partnership that didn't need to work but had to work effectively together to get the benefits out of this. So, kind of in a very briefly before and after view, which is probably similar to a lot of utilities, you go back into a manual world where, customer loses power, customer has to call the call center enters a ticket, maybe that ticket flows systematically in an outage management system, and then you got a bunch of manual things after that, right? Because there's a manual dispatch to the field crews to go work the trouble. They work the trouble. Maybe they radio back in that they've solved it, if you will. And then typically there was manual follow-up of some form with the customer, to verify that power had been restored, providing good customer service and all that. And then, depending on how big the storm was, you multiplied that model, and it took you longer and longer to perform restoration. Versus an after view of that, where you've got AMI meters that, send meter events, and in the case of an outage, it's called a last gasp, if you will, and that event is automated through, I'll save all the technical jargon, but meter head end through a smart grid gateway back into the outage management system. It creates an outage ticket or outage event systematically, and then rolls up to a root cause or common cause, and all that's presented to the operator hands off, and literally a few seconds if everything's working as designed. And then you can, it even tees up into a dispatch to the field. And then it's worked in the field, it comes back, and restoration's verified through a meter ping back to that meter versus having to manually call the customer. And so we may do some customer communications on top of that, so that as a customer, back to the customer expectation comment earlier, so the customer knows that we know, right? And they feel good that we know, and we're giving them updates on restoration and so forth. But that's really not required in the restoration process. That's a customer expectation or satisfaction initiative separate than the actual restoration. And by the way, for those of you who might ask or care, we're LNG gridstream meters. Many of you probably are from an AMI perspective, and all the back-end system software and so forth is Oracle-based. But the unintended part of that, for example, and I put that in quotes because it's not necessarily bad, but if we have significant outage events that occur, let's say we lose transmission for some area, well, think about how many meters could actually be impacted by that loss of transmission. And so you have all of these meters concurrently generating those events, concurrently coming back into the back office, which is a good thing, but yet it's coming in such a volume because of automation and technology that we face some challenges in putting throttles on that so that we can actually process it in a controlled manner as it's coming in. Unintended, kind of a good thing. It's working as designed, but you didn't necessarily design it for all the anticipated use cases or situations that might occur. The other thing, of course, that it produces, back to the overall technology piece, is it's a change in skill set across the workforce. Suddenly, we're talking about differences in technology and the ripple effect of that all the way back into operations, not just IT, but it's IT-like skills. Because at the end of the day, those meters are really configured via firmware or software, and the versions matter so that you get consistency in behavior and all that. And you got a test suddenly. You didn't, the testing the analog meter, did it spin, right? A whole different model today with meters and firmware and everything else. That's also a change, not really intended, but it's a consequence and an outcome.
Great. So I do want to come back to this workforce because I think there are some interesting implications for us in the industry. But Bill, turning to you next, one of the things that you raised, and then Brent, I'd be interested in your take, kind of given your role at Dell. There's lots of conversation around the Internet of Things and industrial IoT on sort of the generation or transmission and distribution side. And lots of exciting opportunities with that. But what are the downsides that you see to that technology?
Right. Well, as you know, the industrial Internet of Things, or the Internet of Things, is really about sensors, but not just sensors, about automation of doing things. And I think generally it's going to be good. I mean, I think we're going to know more. An AMI meter is an Internet of Things in many ways. It's kind of how we've really moved into that. I think probably the downside is what we're facing in the country anyway, which is the double whammy of automation and globalization to the workforce. I mean, one company told me that they had put in for, how we had the spending for building out infrastructure, the
ARA funds.
Yeah, thank you. And they said, we saved millions of dollars in our O&M. I said, how? Well, we reduced our costs. I know, I said, but how specifically? And this was a public company, and it was taxpayer money, and it was a jobs program, and they said, well, we laid off all our meter readers. And I thought, well, wait, this is a jobs, we're trying to create jobs. So automation will create new jobs somewhere else for sure, but I think the impact will be on those people whose jobs are primarily going to be lost as a result of automation. Is that a bad thing? I think it's just that's how things are going to be. We don't have blacksmiths anymore. The horse industry has gone away. I mean, that's how it's going to be. So there is always a downside. There'll be new jobs created, but old jobs eliminated. I think that's probably the impact of automation.
Okay, so we're building the tension around the workforce conversation, but before we go there, Brent, I mean, you're probably paid to say good things about IoT, but from your perspective, what is the downside of the technology, or what are the potential risks?
Well, I mean, just to kind of pick up on Bill's comments, I mean, about the workforce, I mean, I think there is, if you look back at technology, I think the forward view does, people do look at the glass, it's half empty. But when you look back, you kind of see where the new technologies and where have created new jobs, new skills, usually in even improvements in quality of living standards, though you can argue over there's inequality arguments to be made, but at the same time, holistically, if you look across different societies, technology has mostly had favorable impacts. It doesn't mean it always goes straight up and to the right. There's dips and curves and so forth. But I think just to go back to Charles' example, so if he's got EMI and he doesn't need meter readers, but now he's got a firmware issue on how to manage meters and smart devices and so forth. Well, there's other jobs that get created around that. And as you talk about the future, you think in terms of even things like drones and other application areas where there's going to need to be a drone fleet manager at delivery companies, or even in the utility industry, maybe monitoring in the transmission distribution spaces, right? So those are jobs that don't exist today, but in the future, we'll have. And I think the title of this panel was, the unanticipated and unintended consequences, which by definition means it's the ones we're not thinking about. So I think the workforce and globalization conversation is, of course, being written large across certainly this country. I think even across the globe, it's a conversation people are having, not just about the power industry, but just in general conversation. So I think there's certainly an aspect on the energy business, and it's an industry that touches everybody. It touches everybody's lives. Not mentioning there's still 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to power on a daily basis, but for those in Western countries, we mostly have energy, and it touches all of us. And I think as, I guess, not stating this from a Dell perspective, but from my perspective, it's the companies that embrace the change. And as I said, I think we're just at the starting line. It's those that are getting involved in the challenges ahead that are finding the opportunities that kind of move ahead and iterate. And that's tends to be, in history, how progress has been made. Otherwise, you can sit back and just wait. And sometimes that doesn't work out so well. So, that's just the perspective I would bring.
Yeah, so, all of you have spoken about the kind of nature of the skill sets that are needed as utilities embrace various technologies. And I happened to have a conversation over lunch with a gentleman who is a director of talent acquisition for a vertically integrated utility. And he was saying that one of the challenges that they face is that they know that they need these new skill sets around, whether it's software engineers or folks who understand how to deploy industrial IoT within systems, whatever the case may be. At the same time, they have these legacy systems where you got to keep the plants running, right? And so they're finding it difficult to to use the overused metaphor, change the engine while the plane is running, right? I mean, you can't. Charles, you can't go down for 6 months while you retool your workforce and the grid, right? So how do you feel like the industry ought to be thinking about this from an intentional standpoint? Because the actual title of the panel is Designing for Unanticipated and Unintended Consequences, right? So we know that there is this kind of change that's coming. How do we actually design for that from a workforce standpoint? Maybe, Charles, we start with you.
Well, one of the things that we're doing, and it's reactive, to your point, because we're way past the opportunity to be proactive. So it's reactive at this point. But demand far exceeds supply.
In terms of employees?
Yeah, in terms of employees who have the internal skill sets, or even incoming new hires don't necessarily come in armed with the skills that we're looking for today from an industry perspective. And so to address that, you've really got to drill back into the supply side of that, which is back to the schools and universities and partner with them on what are the skills we need, partner with them to develop the degree programs, especially in the graduate areas, partner with them on research, help establish the degree programs that have the academics behind it, and then offer them internships. Actually don't offer, encourage, push for it, so that when folks walk in the door, it's not just academic experience, because that's great, but it's also hands-on experience, preferably through internships, where you develop the partnerships, you get some stickiness there with those candidates before they get into the job shopping mode back in school, and you get a good quality hire that walks in the door with some practical experience already. That's what we're working on. That doesn't happen overnight. That takes investment, it takes time, but if you don't do that, where are you going to be? You're left retraining the workforce internally. And oh, by the way, across the board, right, from an industry perspective, we're facing a huge retirement cliff with a lot of folks retiring. Now, that's not all bad from the perspective that workforce that's retiring is used to the historical model or the analog model. And I often talk about it this way. I think a lot of the knowledge that's out there historically running the utility is experience-based and instinct-based, because they knew what to do because they had done it so much, and it was by instinct they knew what to do. In the future workforce, in the digital world, if you will, it's decision-based, based upon the data that's created from all of those digital devices, and then it's packaging that data through analytics and decision making, and folks make the decisions, know what to do based upon the data. That's a very different model. There's, say it this way, there's some resistance to that change out there, but by and large, it's just an evolution through the workforce driven by technology that we have to figure out how to embrace and be successful at, which is quite a different model than historical norms.
So Brent, what's your advice for utilities on being proactive about this?
Yeah, well, I actually think I heard it at this conference, or I might have read it, is that in this industry, it was a statistic, I know it stuck with me, 40% are approaching retirement age. And I forget what the time horizon was, but it's not that far out. And so I think the risk is if you don't embrace the technology to create some automation or create new opportunities, number one, you might not have enough of the workforce left to help keep the lights running, keep the lights on. But secondly is, I think, again, to build on Charles' point, it's like if you want to reach back to the universities and to the supply chain of the talent pool, how are you going to pull them into your industry? I think it's because there's an exciting world of opportunities that exist inside the energy space. If I know Silicon Valley and others get a lot of, get their own TV shows, for example. But it seems sexy and so on and so forth, and you create pets.com or whatever. No offense if they're not still around, so I guess I don't have to worry about them. But the point is that they're working on a lot of different problems. But how could you not get excited about working on the grid of tomorrow? Because I think it's again, it touches everybody. It's an important critical asset for everything we do and for our lifestyle. So I think there's an opportunity actually for the energy industry to, at Dell we use the term, it's about unlock the human potential, and it's really about applying technology in a way that allows human potential to emerge in new and different areas. And so I think for the energy industry, it's about taking these technologies, applying them, from a Dell perspective. We're looking at providing compute and connectivity infrastructure across the spectrum from the edge to the core to the cloud. But we're looking at partners and other companies who are bringing the applications and the analytics and the deep domain experience in the industrial Internet of Things and in the energy sector to really help solve some of these problems. And that's creating jobs. That's creating, it's also creating interest, right? Interesting jobs. So I think you kind of look at this as a problem or also as an opportunity. How do you put those two together and create something that is actually challenging and exciting for the talent pool that's coming up that entices them to want to work at this job of the energy network of the future, whatever we want to call that.
Bill, what do you have for us?
Well, as those who have ever heard of the Strawberry Alarm Clock, you must know how old I must be, right? If I played in a band that long ago. So I've been in this industry for years and years and years, and one of the things that I've observed over the years is that the utility industry seems to be a combination of high tech and ancient rituals, right? And I'm in the technology business. I work for a company that makes GIS, not gas insulated switchgear, but geographic information systems, right? And one of the examples I like to think about is, what they are, right? GIS is maps. Most people have them. And we've spent a lot of time and effort in this industry to make sure that the new digital maps look exactly like the old ones that we did on paper. We spend a lot of effort in taking high tech and adapting it to our legacy workflows. So if I were to say, for those in the industry, think about all of the things that we do. I mean, every day when we go out to the field, when we do this and we do that, and what are the things that we could just get rid of? And I call them sacred cows, the things that we just never would ever to think to change, and get rid of them. Kill all the sacred cows. I mean, there were a couple of instances this morning about, we have this fixation with the meter. It's that we don't do anything after the meter. That's a sacred cow. We send out bills once a month. Why? Because we've always sent out bills once a month, and they have to be on paper, or they look like bills. So there are so many things that within the industry, and we sometimes adapt our brand new technology to do old-fashioned workflows. And when we do that, and I hate this, they customize the software. You know, I've heard folks from right? We customize the software because somebody thinks that we have to do it this way. And you say, well, that's all going to be solved when the old people retire, like me, they retire. You know what? We pass these legacy things down from generation to generation. And so we continue the workflows even though the new people are here. However, the millennials are going to go nuts, right? Because they're going to go, you know, where's my, you know, I'm going to type like this. And so I think we're facing that challenge today. But I think the utility industry and the energy industry in general, they have to kill the sacred cows. They have to search them out and kill them. And once they do that, applying new technology, it'll be much, much easier.
All right, I don't know
kill
how
any cows here while they're
I don't know how we follow that up. No, I think that's great. So I do want to turn for a moment to the consumer side of things. So one of the things that we've seen in our research is that residential customers have a very low awareness and opinion of their utilities' ability to do the kinds of things that we're doing. So just a couple of stats, for example, only 39% of customers trust their utilities to keep their personal information safe. Only 8% say that their utility keeps its system safe from terrorist or cyber attacks. And I mean, I know working with the industry, and I imagine, you know, most of you in this room do as well, that the industry is actually doing quite a bit. How do we turn around and communicate about, okay, let's, you know, start that by saying that, you know, our industry is not the sexiest of things, right? To the point about how do we attract new talent. Then we're layering cybersecurity on top of it. So, I mean, we're a couple of steps removed from sexy at this point. How do you communicate to customers to create the confidence that you are, in fact, thinking about the potential risks out there and managing them effectively? Charles, you want to
Oh, glad you started with him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a near and dear topic as well, because when I think about the change topic, you know, IT used to be viewed as the corporate IT, right? Something doesn't work, call IT, you know. These days, a huge amount of time is spent not on those things, but on things like cybersecurity. And you're right. I don't know how those numbers compare with other industries or perception of other industries, right? But they seem very low. Now, part of that, and I may be a little bit biased, I think the press doesn't do us any favors because you get a lot of hype in the press about security of the grid, which, by the way, we need it, absolutely need it. But to your point, we're doing a lot of things to ensure reliability, resiliency, cybersecurity of the grid that don't get out into the press, for example. So you get documentaries, you get books written, you get transference of things that may happen internationally into the domestic world and model, and you get a very gloom and doom type of message from it. Not to say there's not risk. There is certainly risk. But we, and I'm not sure who we is or how we do it, but we have to also get the message out of the things we are doing. Part of it does go back, for example, when we go to classrooms and talk about what we are doing from a technology perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective, we get a lot of surprised looks and we get a lot of questions, which is a good reason to go and invest that time that eventually should pay back to us, right? But the knowledge is not out there, the things that we're doing. I mean, we as an industry, through NERC SIP, if that resonates for anybody in the room, and I won't go down lengthy explanations, discussions about that, but we face some of the most stringent cybersecurity requirements and standards that are out there domestically for any line of business. And we're held accountable to that through audits and things of that nature. Show me another industry that's held to that standard and where it's enforced. And by the way, that's a moving target every day, right? But that's very uncommon, but yet what you said, Casey, is true in terms of public perception. And so we gotta figure out how to overcome that.
Bill or Brent, any insights for folks in the room that, you know, how they can better communicate the work that's being done?
Well, I think it is communication and, you know, expectation setting. You know, a little bit it's the, I guess, you know, the only times I guess most consumers think about their electric utility is when the lights are off or my bill's too high. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the time, they don't think about it. And in some ways, that's a good thing. I mean, that's a, you know, you keep the lights on, the energy's there all the time. I've heard some different slogans around the country and around the globe in terms of, you know, what utilities are doing. I think that's fine, but a little bit maybe this is the model of taking technology and applying it to the old workflow of what the utilities were responsible for, and maybe as we move forward, where there are more distributed energy assets and there are more consumers and commercial industrial customers as well, connected into the grid as part of supplying energy in two ways, and the utility has an opportunity to kind of rebrand itself and to really be seen as kind of a network that's providing a different kind of value and protecting those assets and protecting customers' information and so forth. So I think there's probably a lot that could be boiled down to just communication about things that are being done or have been done, and then also like some of the new things that I know we hear a lot about at this conference, what utilities are looking at in the future, because those are pretty exciting. And I think as you start to talk about those as well, you're wrapping that into the security and the aspects of management that are required to kind of keep those things happening. It's very complicated, very complex set of systems. And I think that actually starts to put the utility in a little bit of a different light. It's more on a front foot as opposed to just reacting to customer surveys when their only really interaction today is, hey, my bill's too high.
Right. So we are getting towards the end of this panel. We've got about 10 minutes left, and certainly we can continue the conversation up here. But if there are any questions that those of you in the audience have, yes, sir.
What role do you guys anticipate AI is going to have in the industry? That is a great unknown that a lot of us outside the industry are going to experience. What do you think will happen? Have you guys discussed that amongst yourselves or analyzed that?
Well, let me just take that. So as I say, I work for a software company that delivers software to the utility industry, and of course it's geographic, and AI becomes, artificial intelligence becomes a really key piece of that, so that as workers evolve from just know, or even kind of knowing what's going on, and imagine if someone were to open up a pattern mount transformer, for example, and right now they can look at only that, whereas with AI, they're looking at data that's coming from their system, maybe their GIS and their work management, the whole conglomeration of systems, so that they can begin to look at the system in a much more holistic way and and safer and quicker. So I think the AI from a worker perspective, field perspective, should transform the way workers do work in the field. And now you see the glasses or the
AR,
yeah,
VR,
virtual reality, all that stuff. So that would be really good.
And certainly from a Dell perspective and Dell Technologies, we're talking about the infrastructure for IoT across edge, core, cloud, putting analytics, computation where it's needed in the architectures, and how does localized analytics running generates local machine learning that then translates into cleansing data that then goes upstream into bigger data processes, where now then you're actually applying more holistic automated intelligence or artificial intelligence that's looking across multiple systems or multiple locations, and now then applying, updating algorithms, sending it back down to the edge, running a process differently. That's absolutely being done today, and I think the things that will start to improve upon that is as the infrastructure becomes more standard, we connect more things into this infrastructure, the algorithms will get more and more take advantage of that compute and connectivity, storage, networking, et cetera, that's across the architecture, and you'll see even more of that. I think there was a conversation I had at lunch today that was talking about material science. Actually, it's a little bit different than energy, but it's related because a lot of core innovation about energy generation and so forth winds up being a lot about material science. And so the conversation was that as high-speed integrated computing power has come together, it's actually creating transactions that are happening much, much faster, and they're actually halving the time it takes to basically take any element on the periodic table and compare it, and then deciding in artificial intelligence, does it really make sense? Does this work? What are my characteristics? And then if I decide to go forward, I'll take it into the real world and do that experiment for real. And it's cutting this time in half to bring new material technologies into the real world.
Okay. Another question.
Back to the issue of the workforce. The aging and exiting of the workforce is perhaps an opportunity to freshen the view, but also a risk in terms of loss of the knowledge and all of that instinctual characteristics. I mean, have you guys thought about teaming experienced workers with newer workers, with IoT people to make sure that as this, because data is only as good as the analytics that turn it into information. So, you know, and making sure that the interpretation of the data is turning it into valid information with experienced guys, but also, you know, kind of combining those. Is anybody working in terms of those kinds of diverse teams to bring them together?
Well, I've seen some examples of that, and again, going back to my old days working in a power company, there were people just, as you said, they just knew stuff, and it was hard to, and then they announce 2 weeks that they're going to be leaving, and you get 2 weeks to kind of get everything out of their head. You can't do it, but so you can use science and experience together. So, for example, a simple case would be if you have a person who has been working in the field for years, maybe as a supervisor, and you said to them, well, show me on a map where the riskiest places are on the system. Just a very simple, just draw with crayons around that. And say, you know, I know that, and no one else knows it, but I know it. And then, but then you take on top, and then you can digitize that data, and then add it to the science, the historic failures, the tree trimming history, all of that stuff, and kind of use that experience layer as a historical layer to help in your future decision making. You may not weight it 100%, but you can take it and capture it forever. And of course, it will, over time, it will become less useful because things will change. But I think we've seen a couple of power companies do that. As their experienced workers leave, they leave a legacy behind them of things that they just know. But you can't just put it on, you can't just talk about it. You have to put it in some kind of a database, a science-based system. And there are ways to do it. How effective in the long term, I don't know. But at least some people are making an effort to do that.
Charles, what's your approach?
One example of that comes to mind, we're in the middle of placing our customer and billing system right now. One of the reasons why we had to do that was that the knowledge that had created all the customizations in that software over the years, none of which were documented, of course, was walking out the door one at a time via retirements. And to go explain that to your CFO and your CEO that says, you know what, we can talk about technological obsolescence all day long, and that's a factor. You can talk about capabilities that are available in new software. Yes, that's a factor, and it has value. But the one that scares me the most is the stick that's chasing us every time we have a retirement out of this team, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And every time we go and we have a rate case, and we have to come back and custom code the agreements out of that rate case into that system, and now we've got layers upon layers of customization and decision making over time. Something is going to break at some point that we can't fix in a timely fashion. And so that's a pretty scary proposition. And so one of the things obviously we're doing, we're putting new systems in. Those new systems are not dependent upon custom coding. They're configurable, they're data driven, and oh, by the way, the business themselves can do a lot to maintain and test those new systems that in the past took IT to custom code. So there's a big evolution of change there for the good.
So I think we've got time for one more brief question. Did you have one?
Yeah, I have. You can pick. I'm going to ask you two, and you can pick whichever you like. The first one is, as things get more interconnected, obviously you have more vulnerability, not just in the utility sector, but across the board. But what kind of things might you think of to mitigate it? Would it be modularity or something else? The second question is a little further down the road, as AI becomes more a more implicit part of how operations run. Maybe you get to a point where decision making goes beyond the human participation, and if that were the case, how would one ensure that the human priority was part of the management, or does it even need to be?
That's an interesting question. That's a lot of elements to that. So I don't know that it can answer all of it. I think the obvious part is, security comes first. First, physically in the grid when you talk about safety, and then secondly, and equally as important, is the security of the information that's involved. And I think that's that's something that you take very diligently. You design from the beginning. You use layers, and you create. I think some people mistakenly think of security as a destination instead of a journey. It's something that you need to build and evolve, and over time make sure you're building architectures that support and evolve with it. To your second question, I don't know when Skynet turns on and lights up, will it be too late? Will the robots all come and find us? But I tend to take the glass half full approach that technology is helping us in the long term.
But even before Skynet, if we talk about unintended consequences, are we thinking about what could be the unintended consequences of a decision being made at certain stages without human participation, with the intent of being more efficient and more responsive?
Well, I think certainly the self-healing grid is a kind of a great example of automation that historically has been handled by people. I mean, it's always, you know what I mean by self-healing grid, right? Switches open and close, an outage happens, and nobody gets involved in it. And I think that's an example of perhaps unintended consequence of a smart grid would be, or its self-healing would be, somebody could get hurt that was not there, or there was no checks. The other thing is self-healing grids are dependent on good data, and if you don't have good data, you could be making automated decisions based on incorrect data. I mean, we saw those examples of the spacecraft, crashing because of good data. So the other thing that you talked about, I think, was connectivity, of things being connected. So the second part of that, I think technology is becoming more web services based typically, so that systems used to be hardwired together. Nowadays, they're not, even within systems, are not nearly as hardwired. They're more about messaging and that sort of thing. So I don't think, so that way you can take things, you can unplug them back and forth. So I don't think that's going to be as big an issue. Now we don't see things having to be, well, do you integrate with this and that? Well, no, we all kind of publish services that are consumed by other systems. So I think that won't be so bad.
Great. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the conversation this afternoon. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And enjoy the rest of the conference.